Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of outsider music, looking at music created from people who are outside the industry, typically lacking musical academia and any other sort of information or knowledge related to the creation of music. We're moving forward with an band named Jandek. The track we're looking at is Naked in the Afternoon. This was recorded, or at least released, back in 1978. Let's see what's going on here. Alright, I'm certain now the guitar is out of tune.
Teenage daughter who's growing up naked in the afternoon. I know a brother close to his mother who stays out late in the evening time. I keep repeating, it takes a beating to grow naked in the afternoon. You are a cowboy if you wear those boots. You are a cowboy when you wear those boots. Big time in the city, big time in the city, big time in the city, big time in the city.
This whole song is just exceptionally unsettling.
I got a letter I read in the paper. I said a man was shot to death. I said a cow gave poison milk. Big time in the city when you wear those boots. I keep repeating, it takes a beating to wear those boots in the afternoon. You call it a question, you call it a color. Well, I got a letter, I think it's a vision. Big time in the city, I got a vision. I know a brother close to his mother. After the morning, you've had your rest. Time to go naked in the afternoon. Take off your hat, take off your coat. Big time in the city, you had your rest. I got a letter. You are a cowboy, read in the paper, big time in the city. it's time to go naked in the afternoon.
I'm really curious about the guitar work. Yeah, I mean that's more of what I was expecting from this theme, more so than yesterday's. Daniel Johnston, was it? Um, Primarily because the lack of knowledge from within the music world tends to create more esoteric art like this. Um, so I was really surprised when yesterday's track made a lot of sense musically. What's going on here is a lot of dissonance. The guitar, I think, is both not tuned and tuned oddly. Players probably know what I mean by that, but for those who don't play the guitar, let me straighten this out a little bit. So there are standard tunings for the guitar where you tune each of the 6 or more strings, depending on what guitar you have, to specific notes in order to create specific shapes or patterns with your left hand that allows you to easily access whatever chords you're going to want to be playing with. I think this uses a non-standard tuning in that sense, where the 6 strings are not tuned to any of the typical ordering of notes. But I also think it is untuned, where there is minor intonation differences between the strings themselves as well. So not only are the shapes and patterns going to be odd and produce strange results, but even if the notes would normally work together harmoniously, dissonance is going to come out of it. That's what I'm hearing here. But there's also some really interesting decisions about movement on the guitar as well. A lot of it is just strumming, 3 to 4 strings, occasionally playing individual strings out of those to create uh, a bit of movement. Maybe you have a couple strums on 1 to 2, beats 1 to 2, and then maybe on the end of 3, you might pluck one of the strings, and on 4, you might pluck another, and then you go back to the full chord. And so it creates this movement, this ebb and flow to it of width and narrowness. But occasionally, there's these very interesting jumps to what I think is the highest string. Definitely jumping at least an octave in pitch, randomly throwing this note in there. And of course, it is not in tune with what's going on around it, which is a weird thing to say when most of this track is lacking tonality to begin with. It's lacking a general tuning to begin with. So the guitar ends up just feeling exceptionally tense. It creates an ominous atmosphere. It's just filled with dissonance throughout the entire track. There's also an uneasiness to the slowness of it and the um, lack of rigidity to time in a few places where the guitar just kind of plays behind the beat occasionally and it feels like time is getting stretched. And that, with the sparse amount of playing in the guitar, just makes something that feels exceptionally uneasy with a very tense tonality to all of it. All of this is elevated and multiplied by the vocal work, which is occasionally in tune with one of the notes that the guitar is playing, but for the most part of the time, playing out of tune with the guitar as well, creating another layer of dissonance. The vocal work also plays around with a lot of slides where we'll hit one pitch and slide into another, and it's usually not a half step away usually a whole or a whole and a half away, 1.5 steps, really creating these long slides. And that only adds to the eeriness of the ambience. It is a track that is wholly unsettling. The few lyrics I tuned into made no sense at all, felt very surreal, and just kind of pairs with the eerie, unsettling element of the music in a way that makes it feel cohesive in a way that I didn't think was going to be possible. And that's a rundown of the whole track. I mean, that's what it says to me. That's what it's doing. That's everything I could say about it. It is a minimalist piece, not to be confused with minimalism, but it is a minimalist piece. There's only two instruments, and it just plays around with intonation and dissonance in a very eerie way. Now, I want to tack on this little conversation here real quick. We've talked about this going the other direction previously when a well-known composer or artist or band makes something very esoteric and traditionally bad, and then they get praised for it. And I've always wondered, in fact, a couple of those reactions I've stated out loud, would this receive the same pretty much unanimous praise if it wasn't coming from this artist, if their history and pedigree did not accompany the piece itself? And so we get something like this, although it's not entirely similar. See, let me back this up a step. Context alters perception. If I listen to something and I'm like, wow, this is really rough around the edges, and then someone tells me, oh, well, it's a demo, I want your feedback on it so we can improve it, that puts it into context. It's not a bad song anymore. Now it's something, now it's a work in progress. Literally, they are working on it. If it is released on an album in that same state, I will have some negative criticism for it because it feels incomplete. And so the same thing applies here, as I just spoke about with having a famous composer create something that's a bit more difficult to digest, and that having that name tied to it is context that has us evaluate the work in a different spotlight or in a different perspective. The same too can be said here. This is outsider music. And so I know that this was written by somebody who had no knowledge or minimal knowledge of music, whether that is composition, uh, performance, or even both. And so I view it a little bit differently. Because if, I don't know, say a famous band, had their name tied to this rather than Jandek, maybe Korn. Korn releases this. I think this would get a lot of pushback because of the context of it. Whereas since it's released by this person who I've never heard of before, I'm going to assume is only known in smaller, more niche circles, and I'm having this outsider music concept tied to it, I think I'm viewing it more favorably than I normally would. Because what I just did in my breakdown, my analysis there, is I approached it as is, as if it were created by a, a musical professional who knew what they were doing, had a vision in their mind, and executed it exactly as what they wanted. Is that what happened here? Or is this the result of somebody who doesn't understand what they're doing and is just fiddling around with stuff? And the next question to ask is, does that matter? Do the events leading up to the art's creation matter in the art's existence? I think objectively the answer is no. The art should stand on its own, but subjectively, I do view things differently based on the context of it. And so I did give this an analysis as a work of art existing on its own, but if I were to be more subjective about it and maybe a little bit less forgiving of some of the elements, I do think I'd walk away from this not calling it necessarily art, not necessarily viewing all of the eerie and creepy elements as components that worked into building a specific style, but again, a bunch of ideas that came from naivety or ignorance, not knowing how to make music and creating this in the process. And does that change the art? I don't know. I could very well see this having shown up during our Bad Songs week. In fact, we had the Shags show up during Bad Song Week, which is more outsider music. I don't really know where to take this. I don't think that there's any direction I can point to. I don't think there's any nice way to wrap this up with a neat little conclusion. It's just something that I started thinking about in the middle of this track. Is if I had heard this in a different context. If I had heard this during Bad Songs Week. If I had heard this during a special selection. If I didn't know who made it. Would my analysis, would my reaction even have been different? I don't know, and I can't know. But I am curious about it. So I gave it a very positive read. If you don't have that reaction to this track and you just think it's not a great song, I think that's a fine position to have. And if you find this to be some of the best avant-garde high art you've ever listened to, I think that's a fine position to have as well. I think that's what makes outsider music interesting to me. Because it pulls intention out of the question. Or it pulls intention out of the formula. Because for the most part, these artists can't make what's in their head because they don't understand the music enough to do that. They don't know the chord theory to achieve the emotions they're aiming for, and maybe they can land upon it through sheer experimentation, but I think more often than not, we're going to get something like this, which is musically exceptionally rough, but artistically interesting. Let's hit some lyrics. Yeah, as I suggested, the few lines I picked out were very surreal, and the lyrics as a whole just lean right into that. Um, there really isn't anything here I can get a strong grasp on. It feels like word salad at times. Says big time in the city. I got a letter. I read it in the paper. It said a man was shot to death. It said a cow gave poisoned milk. I keep repeating, it takes a beating to wear those boots in the afternoon. You call it a question, you call it a color. I just, none of this, if it's metaphorical, it's all lost on me. There are multiple callbacks to being naked in the afternoon, multiple callbacks to these boots. It says you're a cowboy when you wear those boots. The boots come up quite often. The phrase you're a cowboy comes up a couple of times. Uh, the idea of getting a letter comes up a couple of times. The first time, though, he gets the letter in the paper. The second time, he gets a letter and he thinks it's a vision. And then the idea of big time in the city is something that crops up multiple times as well. But, I mean, what it all means is just as esoteric and cryptic as the music is eerie and unsettling. And I think the two of those combined create a very emotionally strong track. It is something that I can't say I enjoyed listening to for the way it made me feel. And I think knowing the lyrics now is only going to amplify that feeling on a second listen. So, those are my thoughts on Jandek's Naked in the Afternoon. What'd y'all think? Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed it, if there's anything that stood out to you, your perspective on it, if you have a unique take, your opinion, all that stuff. Throw it in the comments. Above the comment section in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you to this menu. You can find my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could like, subscribe, and ring the bell, I greatly appreciate all three of those. We have a special selection coming up next. Otherwise, we'll be back tomorrow. We're going to check out some more outsider music. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.